Good day and welcome to Cyber Disaster Recovery and Incident Reporting. My name is Thomas Deere. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Engagement at the Chamber, and I have the privilege of being your host. A big thank you to each of you on the call and joining us today, and thank you for your membership. You have joined in listen-only mode with your microphones and cameras muted. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the program using Zoom's chat box. Today is the second of a four-part series on cybersecurity presented in partnership with Oswald companies. As we learned from the first session, cybersecurity is an evolving risk that poses a threat to businesses of all sizes. We found out at our last seminar that experts estimate that a ransomware attack occurs every 11 seconds. If you're not already, you should be considering a cybersecurity risk plan for your company, which can help cover the financial burden of paying ransoms and lost profits, along with concerns from business interruption from a cyber breach. Today, you're going to hear from two amazing experts from Oswald, Lacey Rex, Vice President of Cyber Strategic Leadership, and Lisa Pape, the Senior Claims Consultant. They will address trends in cyber claims, carrier resources, and what to do and not do when you have a cybersecurity incident. Oswald is a full-service risk management firm focused on a proactive insurance brokerage partnership. They provide property and casualty insurance, including emerging risks, along with an employee benefits program. Oswald is one of the nation's largest independent insurance brokerage and risk management firms. By living their core values of passion for excellence, integrity, resourcefulness, and commitment to community, they become a leader in the industry with an incredible 97% retention rate. They deliver peace of mind in a world of uncertainty and take on the heavy thinking for you. You can count on them to protect what matters most to you. It's my pleasure to introduce Lacey Rex and Lisa Pape.
Hi, good morning, or I guess good afternoon. So Lisa Pape and I are going to be talking through, when you have an incident and essentially what to do and what not to do. But if you have any questions feel free to throw them in the chat. We're happy to answer them. So please don't be shy about that. So obviously, cyber disaster recovery and incident response is an important component of just overall cyber resiliency. And just to set the stage, so to speak, I'm going to talk through some of these recent incidents that we've seen just over the past, since 2019 to 2021. And there's been some pretty large and very systemic issues that have occurred that have really been concerns and cause for concern for a lot of the carriers. Blackbaud, and I know Lisa has a few anecdotes to talk through with Blackbaud, but it was data breach of the US software that a lot of nonprofits and schools used and had a lot of donor information. Amazon Web Services had an incident where they had, their cloud hosting provider was down for a substantial amount of time in 2020. And SolarWinds, or as it's widely referred to as SolarGate, occurred in December of 2020, which really was a really tipping point for the cyber insurance marketplace as well. And we've seen a lot of carriers that really solidified their concerns over systemic risks that they had been predicting for some time. It also had a ripple effect because the software that was compromised was pushed out as a software patch, and it affected thousands of customers. So in some pretty large ones, it had a ripple effect where it affected FireEye, Malwarebytes, Mimecast, et cetera. We also saw in 2021, the Microsoft Exchange, the Hafnium incident. So that was a zero-day vulnerability as well, or it was unpatched software that was exploited by the bad actors. There was also Kaseya, similar to the SolarGate incident, where they intentionally affected a software provider for managed service providers or managed security service providers. So affected their software, and then affected their downstream clients. And then obviously Colonial Pipeline, which many of you may know, but that was a result of lack of multi-factor authentication at username, and they were able to compromise the network, and then had a wide-ranging ripple effect with gas in the East Coast. So, these types of incidents really can affect in ways that really we have started to just begin to see. And as a result, we're really seeing these incidents drive the insurance marketplace and really become more problematic, and why the carriers are concerned about these systemic and these system losses. Lisa, I know you had some things that you wanted to add as well.
Thank you, Lacey, and good day, everybody. And it's nice to be on this call with you this afternoon. I certainly can speak, I can give some real life claim experiences involving, Oswald clients with respect to these event system losses that Lacey has set forth. Dating back to Blackbaud in 2019, we had several clients that were affected by this event, and as Lacey had indicated, it was largely targeted at educational institutions and nonprofits. And what we were able to do first is when we started receiving notification of this incident, we were able to get out an advisory to our clients, to this sector of our clients, notifying of this incident and giving them a guidance on what to do, particularly if they had cyber coverage, a cyber policy in effect that would respond to this, to contact Oswald, and we get it reported to the carrier. And also if absent cyber coverage that would respond, contact your broker, contact Oswald, will give you some guidance and some resources to assist you through the event. Ultimately, the Blackbaud incident, at least for our clients, what it really boiled down to, because this was a software vendor, our clients needed to be concerned. It wasn't a system breach on our client's end, but the software was a host of our clients' data. And there was a critical need for our clients to determine whether or not personal identifiable information had been compromised, as they would be required by regulatory compliance to send notification to affected individuals. And what cyber policies provide is they provide you with the resources and coverage for the cost of having a privacy counsel look into whether or not the data that was being held through the software package, if it constituted PII and if notification was required. In some cases, our clients, there was no PII and it was a closed matter. In other cases, it did involve PII and they had to work with privacy counsel to send out notifications. And those costs, if there was a cyber policy in place, were covered by the carrier. I'll jump to the Kaseya incident because that is an interesting one. This 2021 event actually was the second event for Kaseya. Back in 2019, I actually had a larger scale event for Kaseya where they were targeting small to mid-sized businesses in Northeast Ohio. And in one morning between 8 a.m. and noon, I received calls from 4 different clients that their systems were down. And they were all the victim of a ransomware attack on Kaseya, to the extent that it shut down. And Kaseya is a IT software provider. So you can imagine when they're hit by a ransomware attack, it takes down the IT functions. And as a result, I had one client, it actually was a limits loss. Fortunately, they did have cyber coverage to respond to this. but it was a limits loss because it shut down our clients' customers. So they had customers walking away because they didn't have a trust in if our client was going to continue to use Kaseya software. It also involved equipment damage. Our client had to replace their equipment. So there's all aspects and costs that are associated with these types of events. And then lo and behold, Kaseya had another vulnerability just this year in 2021. And it just goes to show you that these bad actors are very sophisticated, and you think that you have addressed vulnerabilities, and they find a way to backdoor ways to for intrusions into systems.
And I think it's important to note too, Lisa, is with some of those incidents that we talked about, so SolarWinds, Kaseya, ultimately the SolarGate, which affected FireEye and those other organizations, our clients didn't necessarily, or those clients, aside from Kaseya and SolarWinds, they weren't compromised, but the software provider that they trusted their data to, they were compromised, and then they were infected by that. And then with Blackbaud, just to clarify too, with Blackbaud, that was a software provider where our clients' information was entrusted into their care, custody, and control. Ultimately, even though I'm sure there was lots of contracts in place, Blackbaud essentially, and this was sort of one of the first instances that we've seen this, but Blackbaud basically sent a letter to our clients and said, hey, we had an incident and you need to notify your clients. They did not proactively notify everyone in their database. They put that back on their clients. So I think it's important to note that you can outsource the function, but you're not going to outsource that liability. So even though our clients did not actually have their network compromised, because they entrusted their data to another third party, our clients were responsible for notification if necessary.
Correct.
Yeah.
And likewise, when you talk about the notifications, that's what was happening with the Microsoft Exchange. Our clients were receiving notification, of a vulnerability with Microsoft Exchange. And depending on the resources that you have within your organization and the level of knowledge within the IT department, we had some clients who received this notification, contacted us, but their IT department implemented the patch and the tools and the guidance as suggested by Microsoft. And we were able to, again, if they had cyber coverage, have a consultation call with the breach response team, with the cyber, to determine, is there any further action that you need to take aside from what's been recommended by Microsoft. The recommendations were, you need to do a 30-day monitoring, look for suspicious activity. Guess what? Lo and behold, I had a couple clients that continued to have suspicious activities even after the patch. And what was determined through a forensics firm was that an older version, a 2010 version of Microsoft, that patch left a backdoor vulnerability. And so there was a requirement for additional tools that were implemented. And they also recommended what they have called endpoint monitoring on the system end to look again for suspicious activity.
Yep. So next, I want to jump into really just kind of helping to quantify some of this. So This is according to the IBM cost of a data breach report that just came out in 2021. So the average dwell time of some sort of vulnerability or someone who accessed your system is 287 days. So that's when they actually gain access and when it's actually detected. So there can be quite the lag time. Typically, if there is remote work involved, so it's the cause of the incident, it's typically almost, it's a little over $1 million more expensive. That's the cost difference than if they were actually in an office environment. And it usually takes about 58 days longer to actually remediate with a remote work environment. And then the average cost is 4.62 million. So obviously it could be less and it certainly could be more, but those are just to help kind of quantify what we're seeing. And oftentimes there can be quite a lag time as well. So what is driving some of the carriers' concerns and what they're concerned about and the issues that we're seeing? So it's the ransomware epidemic. So we're still seeing the severity and the frequency of those incidents. It's certainly not slowing down, and we're seeing that. And then there's concerns over the supply chain, the systemic risk, things like SolarGate, Hafnium, the Kaseya incident. So it's a very real concern. And if you're, say, a manufacturer, and if one of your key suppliers goes down as a result of a ransomware incident, would your policy respond to it under your cyber policy? It's typically excluded under your business income loss because it's a non-physical business interruption. So that's part of the reason that the carriers are concerned about the supply chain, is it can just drag out longer as well. Typically, there can be more liability associated with it, and it can really drive up your business income loss as well. We're still seeing social engineering claims. We're still seeing business email compromises happening quite frequently. A lot of this can be addressed with just implementing multi-factor authentication. We talked about it during the last session, so I'm not really going to dive deeply into that, but multi-factor authentication is absolutely critical to even obtaining coverage these days as well. Looks like we had one question here come in. Since COVID, has there been any noticeable increase of attacks? And I'll let Lisa comment on that.
I think what COVID has brought to the table is with the hybrid, work environment and individuals working remotely, that has increased vulnerability, particularly if you don't have the multi-factor authentication, and as a result, an uptick in business email compromise.
Mm-hmm. And that's when someone gains access to your credentials for your email account. And they then typically, what they do is they'll gain access. They gain access to credentials because we're creatures of habit. We reuse passwords. That's why I think everyone should be using a password manager application. So you reuse passwords as a result. So, if we have a compromised email or it's an easily guessable one, they gain access to the email. Typically lie in wait, look for some sort of transaction, try and intercept, create a forwarding rule, and then really no one's the wiser of these incidents. So, and then a lot of times we see the social engineering, that theft of money will also then kind of that parting gift could be ransomware as well. So I don't know, Lisa, if there's anything that you would add to that.
I would say with the email compromise where they changed the forwarding rules, and it used to be that the term used was phishing, and it wouldn't truly be an email compromise. What it would be is one alpha or letter off in an email chain that went unnoticed. But in today, I've seen a shift where it's truly an email intrusion. The bad actor goes in and changes the forwarding rules, and you have no way really of knowing that you're corresponding with a bad actor. And typically you find this out with the social engineering claim with a fraudulent funds transfer. You believe you've made payment, on an invoice, and you get a call from your supplier inquiring. Lo and behold, you determine my email's been compromised. I will say that and typically what I hear with the email compromises, this was just before we implemented multi-factor authentication. Or do you have multi-factor authentication? No, we don't, we're not quite there yet. Multi-factor authentication, I can't stress the importance in truly mitigating the risk of the email business compromise.
So the next slide really, I mean, I think most of us are familiar with icebergs. Most of it's under the water, obviously the most substantial part of it, but that's really the concern and some of the biggest issues that we're seeing these days. SolarWinds, again, is a good example of this. So they were initially compromised, state-sponsored espionage. They then infiltrated their network, and the SolarWinds then pushed out a patch update, and ultimately infected all of their clients. As far as what has that meant for them? Well, there's also some D&O, but there's some D&O litigation currently against SolarWinds. So I imagine their limits were completely maxed out. We're looking at a D&O suits being brought against them. So it really is a ripple effect. And obviously it's the tip of the iceberg as far as concerns, because there's liability from customers, and then obviously their first party cost as well.
Hey, Lacey, if I could just jump in to give you a claim example of this supply chain ripple effect, because I'm actually dealing with, currently it's a significant, this is a supply chain event, and our client has, a large limit cyber policy and excess coverage. And what they third-partied out their data center. The data center had the ransomware attack. So again, it wasn't our client's system, but their third-party vendor. Well, hence our clients' customers could not access their records, and it shut down facilities. Now, that data center obviously has other clients besides our client. So our client is not going to be relying on their suppliers' coverage. That coverage for the supplier is going to go to investigating the breach, the forensics, the legal. Our client is facing business income loss. They are losing customers who are canceling contracts. They have privacy issues because this is a medical customer. And it is expected that this loss is going to reach the excess layer of coverage. But it affected 3 layers. Well, really 4 layers. The supplier who had the breach, our customer, whose customers' operations were shut down, and the customer's customers were affected.
Yeah, I think it really, I think these types of incidents, it's important to note that they're really catastrophic events, but cyber catastrophic events. So if you think about it in terms of a hurricane or some other kind of devastating event that could happen, weather related, et cetera, it's the same impact. So that's why we're seeing these dramatic increases also in the cyber liability market. So we like to talk a little bit about cyber loss control. And I think it's important to start considering cyber loss control in the same context that you would with a building. So we've got building codes. If you want to insure your building, if it's a wooden building, let's say, it's important that you have sprinklers in order to either obtain coverage or obtain coverage that is adequate. Lack of controls could mean that you are uninsurable. So I really want to emphasize that and the importance of obtaining coverage at this point. And that's really, to Lisa's point, multi-factor authentication. That two-factor is probably one of the most critical, but there's others. Again, we talked about it in the last session, so I'm not going to get into it, but some of the things that we're going to talk about again is just the multi-factor authentication. There's two or more authenticating factors that identify you. So it's something you know and something you have. So it could be, think about it. We've been doing this with debit cards for years, right? You've got your debit card, and then you've got a PIN to access and gain cash or make a transaction with that. So with multi-factor authentication, it could be a password or passphrase, token or smart card, or it could be a biometric identification. So it's going to be one of those usernames and one of those things as well. So the additional critical cybersecurity controls that we're seeing and what the carriers are pushing for as well is patch management process. So back to what Lisa was talking about with the Hafnium incident with Microsoft Exchange, unpatched systems are going to lead to incidents and potential vulnerabilities of your network. We're also seeing a real push for specifically backups, encryption of data, the backups, but they'd like to see it in transit and at rest as well. For larger organizations, this is almost table stakes, but you should have endpoint detection and response. EDR is what it's oftentimes referred to. It can be referred to as next generation antivirus. It's basically artificial intelligence that's detecting anomalies and shutting them down. And then network segmentation, especially if you have end of life technology. So something that can no longer be patched or supported. We see this a lot with our manufacturing clients. It's important that you have network segmentation to really wall off any potential vulnerabilities. Also, just to kind of maintain that separation between business units so you don't have that event that really spreads and affects multiple types of business units or throughout the company, really trying to wall that off as much as possible. Something else that we try and talk to clients about, and I think unfortunately it's oftentimes not taken advantage of, but there's carrier resources with the policies. A lot of them are complementary. So as Lisa mentioned before, they come with a breach coach. So a lot of times there's no cost to it to have a conversation with the breach coach, depending on the policy. Many of them give you access to eRisk Hub, which has some great resources, policies and procedures, and has, news and all kinds of good stuff available. And then there's the disaster recovery services that are included with the policy. So legal, cybersecurity, forensics, crisis management, et cetera. But then some of the not so typical. So we see online training, let's say, some sort of phishing training or security awareness. It could be completely complimentary, or it could be a discount with some of the leading providers. I mentioned the password management application. Some of them provide discounts or complimentary for the first year. Incident response plan review, some bit site scans, or some of the proprietary scans, IP shunning devices. There's a number of them, and they really vary from carrier to carrier. But it is important to understand that, take advantage of it, and perhaps you could get a discount too if there's a type of service that you're looking to engage with or software that you're looking at as well through your carrier and their relationship as well.
Lacey, if I could just jump in, I think I just really hone in on the value added of the carrier resources that come with your cyber policy. It's really the cyber policy that provides the most comprehensive coverage for cyber risks. And later on, I'll get into there's other policies that may respond if you don't have cyber coverage, but in a limited extent. But getting back to the cyber policy, just 2 weeks ago, had a manufacturing client whose third-party vendor for administrative data backup under ransomware attack. We got the call at 1:30 Saturday. afternoon. And this particular client had just gone through a renewal with cyber coverage and unfortunately didn't have controls in place that resulted in a real nominal limit of insurance. But nonetheless, it was a cyber policy. Called the cyber hotline. These hotlines on these cyber policies are 24/7. So we got in touch with the breach response team, and by 6 o'clock that night, there were boots on the ground through the service providers approved by the carrier, to include an IT forensics firm, a cyber extortion expert who was negotiating with the bad actor and could give feedback on what was known about this bad actor, and to also determine and investigate from a forensic standpoint, getting the client back up and running. That all occurred within literally hours. And that is the benefit. And I'll tell you that the following Monday, in following up with the client, although there was, they were looking at a $5 million ransom demand. They had $250,000 in coverage for everything. That client said, regardless, that the resources and the providers that they had through the carrier were priceless, and they could have never navigated through this crisis without the benefit of the resources through the carrier.
Yeah, and we see that a lot, and I've heard that quite a bit, unfortunately. So underrating changes that we're seeing, and something that Lisa mentioned, a lot of times if your controls aren't strong enough, we're starting to see sublimits for cyber extortion. And the case that Lisa was just talking about, unfortunately, the client's controls weren't quite strong enough, but they did have some coverage, and obviously it was very critical for them. But we are starting to see where carriers, they don't have a tolerance for your controls not being in alignment with what they want to see, and sublimiting coverage for certain lines of coverage. We're also starting to see limiting of the dependent business interruption. So that's a result of third parties being down and you having a business income loss as a result of them having a cyber incident or a system failure incident, essentially a non-physical business interruption of a third party. It's a very rigorous underwriting process. I mentioned scans. Almost all of our carriers are scanning their clients or their potential policyholders. And at Oswald Companies, we've invested in our own scanning technology just to try and help our clients as much as possible as part of the pre-renewal process. We're starting to see new exclusions as well. So end of life technology exclusion, governmental shutdown exclusions, a lot of different variety of exclusions. If your controls aren't where they need to be, sometimes we're seeing co-insurance. It could be up to 15%, 50%, which is pretty punitive. And then rate increases, it's anywhere from 60 to 100+%. And unfortunately, this is sort of the reality that we're dealing with every day. So starting early is really imperative. This next slide, we just wanted to give you a little bit of a visual of what it looks like to actually purchase a cyber liability policy and what that process looks like. So completing an application, reviewing cybersecurity controls with your broker, and then them with the actual underwriter, obtaining the quote options, reviewing and essentially binding terms, and then discussing carrier resources. And if you can actually do a claims onboarding call, it's very helpful to understand the process and really drive that home. And I'll let Lisa talk through a timeline of an incident as well.
Thanks, Lacey. Timeline of an incident. First thing is, as soon as you receive notice of any sort of cyber event, doesn't matter what it is, but particularly with respect to ransomware, obviously that's a priority, on email compromise. Ransomware, call your carrier and call your broker. have your carrier's hotline and your policy number in hand. That really is the first line of defense here, or offense, if you will, in responding to the event. If you happen to not to carry cyber coverage or can't secure cyber coverage, contact your broker. I oftentimes field and guide our clients who unfortunately have either elected to or not been able to secure cyber coverage. We have your broker in Oswald, we have the resources to make referrals and schedule consultation calls with a breach coach, a privacy counsel for recommendations. Responding to the plan, implement your initial response to the event, okay? Do you have a response plan in place? If not, it's really important to have one. But there are some preliminary do's and don'ts with a cyber event. One, disconnect from the public network. Set up a temporary email account. Refrain from communicating by business email, because we do not know to what extent the bad actor has compromised the system, and if they're watching and have access to the communications. File an IC3 report. That's the FBI's cybercrime reporting website. It's a simplistic online form that you can complete, and the FBI takes this information and you might be contacted. They may have information on the variant that's intruded your systems. Keep track of your costs, especially for reimbursement through your cyber policy or any other policy that may apply. Make sure you identify your critical systems that need to be restored. What's your priority, so that you're prepared when you triage with the service providers. The next is guidance. Here at Oswald, we work with our clients to coordinate the calls with the privacy counsel, the carrier, the IT forensics. Those calls happen really in short order to triage and discuss next steps moving forward. And then from that point on, you're coordinating with the experts, whether it be IT experts, your privacy counsel, a cyber extortion expert. If you're hit with a ransomware attack, you're faced with the decision, do I pay or not to pay? That decision is ultimately yours. And usually it depends on whether or not you're able to restore from backups, and then how soon, and whether or not they've hit a critical system that needs to be restored. It's usually 50-50 with my clients as to whether or not the ransomware is paid. And then towards the conclusion, if you've done an forensics investigation, you'll receive a report identifying the origin of the intrusion, the vulnerabilities, what actions were taken, and what is the recommendations moving forward. Now, the cyber policies don't respond to actions moving forward. That's a cost that you would bear to improving your system or hardening your network. But that's all a benefit of the reports at the conclusion of the claim.
Lisa, I think that's all great summaries. I think there was a few others that you had mentioned previously about just really the preparation process as well.
Oh, yeah, and we were gonna, that was gonna be on a different slide here. The next slide is preparation. Okay, very important if we wanna talk about preparing yourselves for a cyber event. Harden your network by this. We've talked about this. Implement the MFA, Avoid block sharing applications where you're sending files to a Dropbox that outside parties have access to. Restrict personal email. Oswald and our company came out with a mandate just this past year that we are to refrain from using our business email for personal use. Deploy endpoint monitoring that detects vulnerabilities, and your ability to address those and patch those vulnerabilities. Do you have offline backups? How often are you backing up your data? I mean, I have some clients that have backup data, but they're 6 months old and they really are useless. They're better off, and there's a critical need to pay the ransom so they can get their current information. Maintain good network logs. The IT forensics folks are always asking to look at the network logs in their review to determine what's going on with the event. Have you done a cyber risk health assessment to identify your vulnerabilities? This one just came past my desk yesterday. Are your laptops that are issued encrypted? I had a client yesterday who thought that we had a privacy claim to report to the cyber carrier because a business laptop had been stolen, and this laptop did contain PII information. And I was about to report it to the carrier when she called me and said, "Oh, hold on, no need to report." This involved one of our new laptops that we just rolled out. We just rolled out new laptops, all encrypted. So there's not an ability to access PII. Therefore, we didn't need to submit a claim. Really important, next up, have a plan to access your carrier resources. By this, I mean, if cyber policies, they will have a one-page listing of their approved service providers. That make a printout of that, have it on file, because once your system's gone down, it's difficult to access your policy information, the carrier hotline, and service provider information. If you have hard copies and those are retained by the individuals that will be responding to the event, they'll make your life so much easier, and you have the ready access for that. One thing, getting to these wire transfers, I probably see one of those at least once a week, a fraudulent transfer. Something to be cognizant of is, do you have a callback provision when you receive, and an accounting personnel receive a change for wire instructions? That is a red flag. Anytime there's a change for wire instructions for banking information that you have on file, that it's highly, highly recommended that that's verified by a phone call. Because even if say you're verifying it by email, if you're communicating with the bad actor, that's not going to help out in that instance. And also, there are policies out there that, although you have social engineering coverage that will cover a fraudulent transfer, there may be a condition that there's only coverage if there is if you followed through on a callback provision, which sometimes doesn't make sense, because I'm like, well, if you do the callback provision, how are you ever going to get to coverage, because the transfer won't occur, right? But nonetheless, it's the carrier's way of responding to what they're seeing. They're getting these claims and paying these claims because of a lack of control, and it's their way to implement these controls in order to get coverage. Unfortunately, I had a client about a month ago who had a $600,000 fraudulent transfer, and checked the policy, and there was a callback provision, and they didn't have a callback provision in place, and unfortunately, there's no coverage for this loss.
And I think
Lastly,
it's important.
oh, go ahead, Lacey.
I was just going to say, I think it's important to note too that social engineering, there's some overlap between a crime policy. I always like to clarify crime is theft of money, cyber is typically theft of data. But since there is some potential overlap, there can be some grants of coverage under a cyber liability policy or under a crime policy. Both of them typically have sublimits, though. They're pretty low as well. Unless you're paying more, or your organization's large enough that you could approach, a London market or someplace in Bermuda and you really get a higher limit. So it's important to know that the limits are low, and there should be a conversation around it and understand, is there a callback provision? What responsibility do you have as a policyholder? Because unfortunately, we never want to be in a situation with our clients where they have an uncovered loss, and a lot of times that money is very hard to claw back. So really using caution is so critical, and it seems basic, but organizations of all sizes and sophistication, or in your personal life, you can have these incidents occur, and it's very sad when we have these happen.
And I have found that, oftentimes if I've got a client that has a crime policy with social engineering and a cyber policy with, they call it e-crime, with fraudulent funds transfer, both supplement, let's say they both have supplements of insurance, $250 and $100. On a $600,000 loss, we can stack those limits, okay? So you've got the $250 and the $100 if you have under both coverages. And that's our role, that's part of my role here at Oswald for our clients, is to look for these coverages and exhaust all avenues of coverage under all available policies to see what we can find for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next one, this is more or less a summary of what we've already talked about. But again, I can't stress the importance of, when you are hit with a cyber event, particularly a ransomware, that's probably has the highest, brings about the highest stress level for an organization, and followed by the email compromise if it results in a wire transfer. But again, notify your broker and your carrier, contact a privacy counsel for consultation. If you don't have a cyber policy, they will have recommendations for IT forensics. Preserve your data, file the IC3 report, disconnect all your devices from the network, understand how your cyber policy works. If you got a cyber policy, refrain from incurring costs and starting recovery and remediation until the carrier is on board, because 9 times out of 10, the carrier is going to require their service providers, and they really are the experts in this line of business. Need your IT consultant. That's another thing. Always involve your IT representative, whether it's in-house or contracted out. They're critical in the initial discussions with both privacy counsel and IT forensics, because they can talk the technical, and the IT representative and the IT forensics under the cyber policy, the provider, they talk the same language.
And I think this was our last slide. I know we've talked about this, but I know Lisa would second that prompt reporting is absolutely crucial. So as soon as you suspect something, it's something that you should be engaging your broker, your carrier, really vetting these things. It's not uncommon to have incidents, right? Or notice of the circumstance. And, we get those all the time. And Lisa, reaches out to the carriers, we let them know, and they usually understand. And it's just more of an explanation process at the time of a renewal. who do you want to work with? I think that question, it comes up quite often, and sometimes it doesn't. And it can be really critical for our policy holders. So the carriers have something called a panel, and they have their pre-approved vendors that they want to work with, that they work with quite a bit. They're usually larger organizations, and they have a lot of bandwidth to handle it. But sometimes, especially legal, can be a little bit touchy. So we always tell clients, ask for a panel vendor list. And then if you don't see your vendor on there and they have the expertise, you can always ask. Some carriers, there's no deviation whatsoever, but it's important that you know that and that you're comfortable with them. And maybe if you don't know them, maybe it's a great opportunity to talk to some new subject matter experts. We facilitate calls all the time. So it's not really, it's not uncommon to have a separate firm handling privacy and security incidents versus some that may handle corporate legal issues for you. And then Lisa mentioned this earlier, but how many policies can be affected? She always asks for all applicable policies and reviews them. And, sometimes there are some coverage extensions, but a lot of the carriers are starting to put exclusions for cyber, because there used to be something called silent cyber, where there could be some coverage if it wasn't necessarily excluded. But we are seeing carriers say, you need to really find a policy that's designed and intended to cover a cyber incident. A general liability policy is really not the place, or a property policy for your business income. Most of them are putting affirmative exclusions. I don't know, Lisa, if there's anything that you would add to any of that.
Right. Yeah. There are policies, and the policies that may afford coverage, it's limited coverage, right? Your property policy, if you have an electronic vandalism endorsement, may cover your equipment and restoration, but it's not going to cover legal, and it's not going to cover IT forensics investigation as to the cost. And then it used to be, we would look under the kidnap and ransom coverage of a D&O policy for extortion. And believe it or not, there was coverage for that. However, I am now seeing on renewal policies an exclusion for cyber-related matters. And the reason being is, cyber has evolved. This is a relatively, in comparison to your GL, your property, this is what we'll term a new coverage that is evolving. And with that, the carriers for your traditional policies are responding with exclusionary language and supplements of insurance. But the two primary policies to look at, again, with the cyber, obviously, are the cyber, and then when you're dealing with the social engineering, and always look at the crime for a social engineering carve back.
So with that, we're happy to take any questions that anyone may have. But, we thank you for your time, and hopefully this was informative and interesting. If you have any comments or anything, we're always happy for feedback. We've got 2 more installments. So hopefully you can join us for the next 2 installments, where we'll dig in a little bit more to the actual incident response portion, along with a simulated tabletop exercise in the last. So thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Lacey, I have to tell you, these sessions for me get scarier and scarier. Keep thinking, for those listening, the questions they must ask themselves is my business prepared? And I think if the answer is no, and I think that's kind of the way you feel, is I urge you to reach out to Lacey and the Oswald team. So I want to extend a special thank you to our presenters and partners, Lacey and Lisa, today, for their expertise and their time. As Lacey said, in the coming days, we'll be promoting sessions 3 and 4, which will air in the first quarter of 2022. And I want to make sure you get registered for these informative events, because as the one slide, the iceberg slide, showed us, we've only touched the tip of the iceberg, and it's really scary to think what's underneath that water. If you have further questions or want to learn more about programs at the Chamber, please reach out to me at tdeer@cincinnatiChamber.com. That's tdeer@cincinnatiChamber.com. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's event, and a big thank you for your partnership and your membership. Have a great week.